classed as one of the most romantic films in cinema history. Roman Holiday, released in 1953, was an American rom-com film. At the time of its release, Roman Holiday was very much culturally and historically significant, and even for us today, we see this film as telling us a lot about the atmosphere and the society and culture of the 1950s. But why did it become so culturally and historically significant at the time of its release, and now for us today as well? Well, that question is exactly what we are going to be looking at in this episode today. Before we begin, my name is Gabrielle McMaster. I'm an author and historian. I am here to bring you all the weird and wonderful history that you may or may not know about. So Roman Holiday was directed and produced by William Wyler. It starred Audrey Hepburn and Gregory Peck as the two main actors in this film. The film was received well at the time and it won a lot of Academy Awards. Audrey Hepburn won an Academy Award for the Best Actress, and the film itself won 2 Academy Awards, one for Best Story in a black and white film, and the other for Best Costume Design in a black and white film as well. The Academy Awards during the 1950s were still very much colour and black and white films. The two categories were separated to allow both a fair chance at competing and winning against each other. The film was shot in Cinecittà Studios and on location in Rome in Italy, and this was shot during the time of what is known as the Hollywood on the Tiber era. This is an era where the 1950s and 1960s had a lot of love and desire to film in Italy, specifically in Rome itself. And Rome became very much flooded with international filmmaking on location and in the studios as well. This film was shot at a time that was very significant for America and Britain. It was shot at a time of coming out of the war era and into this new post-war 1950s. And this in itself is seen just simply in the use of the studios. Historically, the studios were set up by Mussolini, the fascist leader in Italy during the war. And for now, Britain and America to be freely using these studios shows audiences today the step that Britain and America took in this new post-war era. This is something we will be addressing later on, because this love and desire for Italy was not just something unique to the filmmaking industry. In 1999, Roman Holiday was selected for preservation by the Library of Congress in the United States National Film Registry. This was due to it being classed as, and I quote, culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant. This boils down to completely how Roman Holiday was viewed back in the 1950s and today. And to understand why this needed the preservation in terms of cultural and historical significance, we need to start delving into the making of the film itself and then looking wider at the audiences. Starting off with making the film itself, it is key to see that Gregory Peck was not due to play the main actor. In fact, Cary Grant was meant to play the role of Joe Bradley. He was the Hollywood favourite at the time. He was what we would call today the heartthrob of Hollywood. And a lot of women today still may agree with that. And when Wyler asked Grant to play the role of Joe Bradley, Grant actually refused because he thought that he was far too old to play the love interest for Audrey Hepburn. Yet later Grant would end up doing exactly that in the film Charade. Looking at Grant's excuse for not playing the role of Joe Bradley in Roman Holiday, it is very important here to see that, in fact, this was something that Audrey Hepburn would end up getting very much pushed into, is those older love interests. In the wider sphere of society at the time, this was quite common. We were coming out of a time of very much financial instability. A lot of women had lost husbands very young, and they were looking for someone who would provide that financial security for them, and that security in general for them. In this sense, a lot of films did have older men playing the love interests to younger women at the time. For Audrey Hepburn films, we see this in, for example My Fair Lady, where she is the love interest of Rex Harrison, and then in Love in the Afternoon as well, quite frankly one of the most controversial age gaps for Audrey Hepburn at the time, within the film itself and in real life too. So after Grant said no, William Wyler then went to Gregory Peck. Gregory Peck agreed, and he signed the contract with the agreement of solo star billing. For those who don't know what this means, this essentially meant that Audrey Hepburn would feature less prominently on the credits and in posters. However, and this is the first major significance that we see for this film, Peck approached Wyler during the filming of Roman Holiday, and he actually suggested that Wyler put Audrey Hepburn on equal billing to himself. At the time, this was very much unheard of. For Hepburn's first major film in America, such a gesture stated early on just how significant Audrey Hepburn would become for the film industry. In a sense, also how significant she would become to culture itself. It was not just the film industry she would have an impact on, but in fact it would be on beauty, on fashion as well. It would be all types of culture. As we said, this was Audrey Hepburn's very first appearance in an American film. She had been acting in Dutch and British films since roughly about 1948, and she appeared on stage productions. Before casting Audrey Hepburn, Wyler had tried actresses such as the very famous Elizabeth Taylor at the time, and instead Wyler thought that Hepburn would be a sensation, in his words, due to her, and I quote, anti-Italian look of not being as curvy as Italians during the era. When Roman Holiday was released, it received a lot of critical acclaim, and it became the second most popular film in the box office in September 1953. And yet, despite such fantastic reception and hitting the box office, it was a disappointment to Paramount at the time. This is because it only grossed roughly $1 million. The disappointment with the US reception for this and the US box office should not have lasted as long as it did, and the reason for this was the cultural significance that this film played in the UK. The film became very successful with audiences throughout the UK because of the romance between Princess Margaret and Peter Townsend, and the recent interest on getting anything to do with Italian culture. Before we delve into both of these reasons in a lot deeper level, first off we need to look at the importance of the royals and the post-war interest in the countries that they couldn't support until now. So looking at the royals itself, a brief overview. We are coming out of a time where the previous king, George VI, stayed in Britain despite being told to move to the countryside because it was safer. He stayed in Buckingham Palace during the war, and a lot of audiences would have remembered this, and the importance of the royals comes straight into play from this stage. In terms of a brief look at why the Italian culture became such of an interest to British audiences, again we are coming out of a time where Italy was the enemy and we couldn't be seen publicly supporting anything to do with Italy or Germany or Russia at the time, and still at this stage supporting anything really to do with Russia is a bad idea due to the Cold War. So delving into these in a more deeper level, with the royals we are coming to a stage where it has been a year since Queen's coronation, which was last year in 1952, and that feeling of the royals becoming so culturally significant again comes into play here. This is further catapulted by Margaret and Townsend's romance. While watching this film, Roman Holiday, the audiences are basically seeing the possibility of a commoner falling in love with a royal and being with them. This is what they were also seeing through the culture of Princess Margaret and Peter Townsend's romance. Peter Townsend was a commoner that Princess Margaret had fallen utterly in love with, and they were seeing this being played out on a screen with Audrey Hepburn and Gregory Peck as well. And it gave the people in the audiences this hope that Princess Margaret and Peter Townshend's romance just might last, or they themselves had the chance of making something of themselves through falling in love with someone who in any other world may not even have them. The beauty of the silver screen at this time, and even to this day, is that we are watching stories taking place before our eyes that we would never presume would ever happen in real life. And yet, in 1953, for audiences, they are watching a story that they would presume would never happen in real life, but yet it was playing alongside this. And this is why the UK really took to Roman Holiday. At the time, we have Princess Margaret being a fashion icon. Everyone wants to wear what Princess Margaret is wearing. They want to see what she is wearing to implement it. They want to see what her hair and makeup are like as well. And through watching Roman Holiday, the audiences are also replicating that love for Princess Margaret and her fashion and her beauty onto Audrey Hepburn as well. This is where culture and society really do interlink. And with Roman Holiday being about this royal and commoner love in the aftermath of the Queen's coronation just a year prior to this release, it sums up the interest that society had at the time in the royals. And it shows how this story really helped the UK box office to hit well for Paramount. Looking now at this Italian fad and this interest for British audiences to now support and have an interest and a fascination with Italian culture, we first need to appreciate that we are finally coming out of the war era. We are now able to support cultures such as German and Italian. As we said, the Russian culture was still off limits at the time, and this was due to the Cold War between the West and the USSR. We were now having this desire to start introducing ourselves to German and Italian post-war culture. At the time, many films were being made in Italy, which fueled this fad even further for audiences. And this was something that was happening throughout the West at the time. People could now see Hepburn and Gregory Peck exploring the city that they themselves desired to explore too. A lot of people were now taking holidays to Germany and to Italy to now experience the country that previously they may not have even been able to go to. For a lot of the audiences who would have been watching this film, seeing this playing out on the screen, this place of wonder and culture, they themselves were now having a desire to go to it as well. And for a lot of audiences who may have seen this film, they would have had this desire to go and further explore Italian culture and maybe even revisit this film on the silver screen. And the interest in the Italian fad through Roman Holiday really summed up the after effects of the war for audiences. It further renewed this interest in European cultures and the desire to experience it all again without a war looming over them or without these fascist and dictator leaders who previously made them uncomfortable before the war to go near the country. For Roman Holiday, this marks it as one of the most culturally and historically significant films. In summary, Roman Holiday really allows audiences and historians today to see why this film was so historically and culturally significant to audiences in the 1950s. Not only that, it also gives us a brilliant insight into the culture and the society at the time. We can see why this was so popular with British audiences. We have the royal element. This was fueled by Princess Margaret and Peter Townshend's relationship, and we also see why it was significant in terms of the Italian nature to it. It was filmed on location, it was filmed in the studios in Rome, which fueled this desire to explore those European countries that were previously off limits to them due to the war. In the 1950s, we are welcoming in this new generation that are now becoming young adults, and films like this would have appealed to them. They themselves did grow up in that immediate post-war era where rationing was still in place, where those ill feelings were still there, but as a generation we see this desire to move past that and start to explore these cultures for what they are rather than what they had been. This in essence is why Roman Holiday is still to this day so culturally and historically significant. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed this episode all about Roman Holiday, and I hope to bring you some more film history episodes very soon. So thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you soon.